It was shortly after accused marathon bomber Jahar Tsarnaev was captured by authorities that he reportedly told them he and his brother were motivated by extreme Islamist beliefs. And at a summit last week in Washington, President Obama told leaders from around the world that terrorist groups are carefully crafting their message, urging people to act on those violent views.
They propagate the notion that America, and the West generally, is at war with Islam. That's how they recruit. That's how they try to radicalize young people.
The federal government is now trying to counter the impact of these recruiting tactics. But one of the leaders in Boston's Muslim community says that effort is unfairly targeting Muslims. Youssef Vali is the executive director of the Islamic Society of Boston Cultural Center. Youssef, thanks for being here.
It's a pleasure being here with you.
What is wrong, as you see it, with the White House's approach?
Yeah, well, first I want to begin by just saying that I think that the U.S. Attorney here locally has done a phenomenal job in engaging the community.
Carmen Ortiz.
U.S. Attorney Carmen Ortiz, and really listening to our concerns, and to the extent that, including my critique of the program, which I'll get to in a second, including that in the materials that were presented to the U.S. government. So I want to commend her for that and thank her for that publicly. My issue with the program fundamentally is the premise, which is that your faith determines your likelihood of turning to violence.
I want to ask you about that concern with the premise as you describe it. My sense was that President Obama went out of his way last week to say that all faiths have the potential to inspire violence. Let's take a look at some of the comments he made, and we'll come back to the topic.
We all know there is no one profile of a violent extremist or terrorist. So there's no way to predict who will become radicalized. Around the world and here in the United States, inexcusable acts of violence have been committed against people of different faiths, by people of different faiths, which is, of course, a betrayal of all our faiths.
So why aren't those comments enough, as you see it, to keep the president from implying inordinate likelihood of violent extremism or imputing it to Muslims?
I love those comments, but in practice, what happened was the federal government invited only the Muslim community to a summit on countering violent extremism. So to all of us in practice, it just feels like the community is being singled out. When the data is very clear that only 6% of violent extremism here in America is committed by Muslims. In
terms of the people who were invited, I know that right after the summit we interviewed a Somali American woman who works at Children's Hospital and also someone from the ADL here in New England. So it wasn't only Muslims who were invited, right, but a high preponderance?
The vast majority of the folks from the community that were there were Muslim. Yes.
Let me ask you about, I guess, why that is a concern, why the White House might have done it. Obviously, the context for this summit that the White House held was that right now the Islamic State, or the self-described Islamic State, is trying to woo fighters from abroad and having some success doing it. Just today we had 3 Brooklyn men arrested for and charged with providing material support to ISIS or ISIL. Al-Shabaab is urging people here to, perpetrate violence on shopping malls in Minnesota and Alberta. And there have been those attacks, obviously, in France and in Denmark recently. Does that context warrant some sort of higher concern about the Islamic context for violent extremist acts? Or even in light of all that stuff, is it not appropriate to focus on the Muslim community the way the president did?
Well, I'll just speak from my own experience here, which is, as a leader of an Islamic center here in Boston, the 2.5 years I've worked here, not once have I come across anyone seriously flirting with any kind of fanatical ideology. So that's why this feels like, it's singling out. Now, I think the concerns around ISIS, Al-Qaeda as an American, for me are deeply concerning. And I think the right stakeholders from the government, who can influence those situations abroad is important. But again, as a leader in the Islamic community who's been here for 2.5 years, the reality of our community is simply that there is no existence of violent extremism.
When you say that you haven't come across anyone seriously flirting with the idea of, say, going to fight for the Islamic State, have you come across anyone even mentioning it in a non-serious way, in a casual way.
You know, there is such a chilling effect across, you know, mosques post 9/11 that, you know, no one in their right mind would do something like that. But beyond that, I mean, I think what I want to convey to your, you know, listeners and your viewers is that, you know, the majority of American Muslims are good, hardworking people here for economic opportunity, committed to service, and that's really at the core of the Islam that we preach. You know, values of compassion, service. Every other Saturday we have a food pantry at the center, which is open to everyone. You know, we have English as second language courses open for everyone. That's fundamentally who we are as American Muslims, and we believe that is at the core of our faith.
Let me ask you, hypothetically, if you did catch wind in your work at the ISBCC that, say, a young man in the community had talked to friends about, you know, interest in going to join the Islamic State, or had been, you know, watching recruitment videos and said to someone else, hey, why don't you take a look at this? Hypothetically speaking, how do you think you would handle it?
Well, you know, I think when it comes to any young person, you know, whether they're contemplating drugs, gang violence, etc., you know, we'd reach out to them, their family, and really try to understand what's the issue that's, you know, happening there, and to provide the pastoral care that we can. So, you know, that's what we do. But, you know, I think one of the things that we've actually found in at least some of these cases, and at least in the Tsarnaev case, is that these guys were lone wolves. They actually were not connected to community, and in fact, you
mean to a local religious community, not connected in a meaningful way?
Not in any kind of meaningful way. In fact, they find us as deeply antithetical to what they stand for. For example, the Tsarnaev brother, you know, reacted to in our congregation to the fact that our preacher was celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. and what he stood for.
Just for the sake of clarity, this wasn't at the ISBCC in Dudley Square.
It was
right?
in the Cambridge,
right.
In the Cambridge Mosque, yeah.
Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry I interrupted you to get that clarification. So he was upset at a celebration of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life.
Right, exactly. In some sense, what I want to say to your viewers is that, you know, ISIL sees us as enemies, you know, because of the Islam that we preach, and which we believe to be authentic Islam, right? Rooted in compassion and piety, in service, and commitment to our country, America.
The president also said, as you know, at this summit, that he believes there's sort of a broader strain of thought in the Islamic world writ large that concerns him. Let's take a listen to how he described it.
There's a strain of thought that doesn't embrace ISIL's tactics, doesn't embrace violence, but does buy into the notion that the Muslim world has suffered historic grievances. Sometimes that's accurate. Does buy into the belief that so many of the ills in the Middle East flow from a history of colonialism or conspiracy. Does buy into the idea that Islam is incompatible with modernity or tolerance, or that it's been polluted by Western values. And so those beliefs exist. In some communities around the world, they are widespread.
I'm wondering if you have seen at the ISBCC the sort of thing the president was describing there, sort of as he put it, a notion that Islam is fundamentally incompatible with modernity, or is that not something that you really see in your community?
No, I mean, listen, I mean, our congregation lives here in America. It's, you know, sees the opportunity in America, has moved from, you know, a lot of impoverished circumstances, terrible political circumstances to come here and, you know, live out the American dream. So at our congregation, you know, we are committed to, you know, to our country, you know, and to our community, and those are the kind of individuals that you're primarily going to find at the ISBC.
I want to ask you briefly about some comments that Carmen Ortiz made in that framework she presented, where she talked about a possible backlash if the White House didn't handle this broader topic correctly. She said, surging resources to specific communities who haven't directly asked for assistance may actually stigmatize those communities. This is counterproductive and may create a further isolation, alienation, and disenfranchised individuals. That sounds to me sort of like the broader concern that you're raising, and I'm wondering, in the ISBCC community, what's the response been to that summit the White House held?
Well, you know, so I first about that statement, I think the U.S. Attorney is absolutely, right about that statement, and and that's where I think there's a lot of agreement here at the local level, around the reframing of this program. I think in our community, the response has been, is feeling singled out. I mean, again, the data clearly shows that only 6% of violent extremists are Muslims, and yet you're primarily inviting only Muslims to the summit.
All right, Yusuf Vali, thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks so much.